My name is Kosuke Tanigawa, and this is my presentation for the BES2025 annual meeting. The title is Thresholds in Nonlinear Responses of Tundra Ecosystems to Warming. Firstly, old ecosystems store large amounts of carbon, and especially in the below-ground compartment because of the accumulation of organic litter across longer timescales. This below-ground carbon is vulnerable to warming, and especially so in high elevation and high latitude ecosystems because they receive disproportionately high amounts of warming compared to other regions. The way we think about carbon storage in these tundra ecosystems is that carbon is respired from the ecosystem and lost, but at the same time is fixed to the ecosystem by plants. And with warming, the relative abundance of these carbons will shift the ecosystem from being a carbon sink to becoming a carbon source at a certain temperature. However, this assumes that these changes will be linear, and there is a possibility that these changes can be nonlinear. For example, with warming, the current stable state of the ecosystem, which is a carbon sink, might give way to an alternative stable state, which is becoming a carbon source. This will occur at a certain temperature, but before that, there will be a threshold level of warming where the current stable state is destabilized, goes through a nonlinear decrease in ecosystem performance, and gives way to the alternative stable state. And our question is, does such a threshold exist? And if it does, how is it determined? The study area of our project is the tundra in Abisko, Sweden, which is situated around here, way above the Arctic Circle. And the dominant vegetation in this area are meadows, heath, and boreal forest. We ran 3 controlled warming experiments for this project, and all of them were run in a controlled climate chamber and simulating a single growing season, mainly simulating June to October in the field, with 5 levels of warming from +0 to +9, with daily and weekly fluctuations of temperatures. The first experiment was on soil only, and soils were sampled from the heath, the tree line, and the boreal forest. For the second one, the heath masochism experiment, intact soils and shrub cores columns were sampled from the ecosystem and warmed. We had 2 types of masochisms, Betulanana, which is a wildleaf ectomycorrhizal plant, and Empedum nigrum, which is a small-leaf ericoid mycorrhizal shrub. The third experiment was artificial meadow community pot experiment, and this involved sampling soils, herb seeds, and mountain birch seeds from the field and planting them together in one artificial community pot. And this allowed us to test the warming responses of the meadow ecosystem while also simulating tree line advance. Firstly, this is the result for the soil-only experiment and its CO2 respiration. You can see here that the respiration at simulated peak growth, which is the end of July, and the simulated end of August before senescence, both increased with warming, which means that there was higher soil carbon loss under warming, but at the same time, the increase was linear, so there were no thresholds for soil CO2 respiration. Then here we can take a look at the CO2 flux results from the heath mesocosm experiments before the peak, so that is simulated July 19th. We saw no warming responses. But then after the peak, which is simulated August 30th, we saw a nonlinear pattern for the Empedum nigrum mesocosm only. And then before senescence, which is simulated beginning of October, we saw a linear decrease for both Bechuanana and Empyreum nigrum mesocosms. So what this says is that the CO2 flux results depend on season and dominant shrub for these mesocosms, and that there could be a threshold between 4.6 to 6.9 degrees warming for Empyreum nigrum dominant systems. Then here are the results for the CO2 fluxes in the meadow plots. So firstly, before the peak growth, the simulated peak growth, and after, which was the beginning of July and the end of August, we saw no significant warming responses. But then at the peak growth, which is simulated beginning of August, we actually observed that the flux decreased with warming, which means that the carbon fixation increased. And these suggest that the meadow carbon storage could be more resistant, or it could even increase with warming in comparison to the heath mesocosms. So now we have only observed, well, mostly observed linear or no responses. But that was for soil CO2, soil and plant CO2 fluxes, and there were actually properties that showed nonlinear responses to warming. For example, for the soil-only experiment, we observed microbial carbon use efficiency to generally increase with warming, but also nonlinearly decrease at certain temperatures. The same was seen for microbial carbon assimilation for heath tundra, but then a different pattern of stability and then a nonlinear increase at a certain level was observed for the boreal forest soil. And then for the microbial nitrogen assimilation, this showed a similar pattern to CUE and C assimilation for heath tundra, but did not show any responses to warming for the other two soils. So from this, we can say that thresholds were indeed detected, but there was no universal single threshold that was consistent for all three soils. And from this, we can say that indeed there is a suggestion of the switching of soil microbial communities to alternative states here, but at the same time, how this occurs and who is doing it likely differs between the soils. And then we also observed nonlinear responses in the heath mesocosm experiments as well. Firstly, for the Bechuanana mesocosms, we observed the nonlinear response for soil acid phosphatase activity, SLA, and root branching. However, for Empyreum nigrum mesocosms, no nonlinear responses were observed. So from this, we can say that likely only Bechuanana and their associated soil microbes shifted their state with warming. We also detected nonlinear warming responses in the artificial meadow community pot experiment. Firstly, above-ground biomass of the pots were observed to increase with warming and then undergo a nonlinear increase at the highest temperature. And this was consistent for pots with birch seedlings or no birch seedlings. We also observed that SLA and leaf DMC shifted nonlinearly with warming. And these response curves actually differed between the pots with and without birch seedlings. And these results suggest that there was a nonlinear shift of leaf DMC, which might have allowed the nonlinear shift of SLA with warming. And this nonlinear acclimation of SLA might have allowed the nonlinear increase of biomass at the end of the warming gradient. Finally, some brief summaries of the conclusions. So, tundra ecosystems were much more resistant to warming than expected, with mostly linear acclimation observed in terms of CO2 fluxes. But we also observed threshold dynamics for certain ecosystem properties. This suggests that maybe these threshold dynamics might actually be buffering abrupt reductions or increases in carbon fluxes in the tundra ecosystem responses to warming. We also find it important that the thresholds that we observed were context dependent on local factors, such as the dominant vegetations and the existence of tree seedlings. Finally, I would like to show my gratitude to my funding body and my colleagues and analytical staff and the Abisko Scientific Research Station. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the comments, and I will try to answer them as best I can.